Welcome. This is session 4 of the Introduction to Jungian Typology. Today we'll be looking at introverted feeling and extroverted thinking. And this is our first move into the judging functions. So I just want to give a little review of where we've been thus far and how we've arrived here. In the first session, we looked at how Jung constructed the four-function model and what divisions go into it, the first being the sort of Kantian division of perception versus judgment. Then we looked at how perception has two varieties, sensing perception and the sensing types who tend to be much more grounded in the material factual world, versus intuition, which is taking in and kind of squinting your eyes and either taking a sample of the facts and then extrapolating and guessing, basically taking a small sample set and then extrapolating out from that, or taking a huge sample set and then looking for a pattern within that and crystallizing it and kind of narrowing down and generating meanings from that. So we've seen that perception, that first half, is really interested in the irrational facts of the world and what those facts mean, what we can conclude, what conclusions we can draw from that, what connections we can make, and what categories can arise. All of these things that happen when we look at the world in its dumbness, so to speak. Sensing and intuition, though they can both appear very smart in ways, although sensing doesn't usually get called that, but it can. You can see intelligence in the dexterity of someone's needlework with introverted sensing, or you can see intelligence sometimes in their incredible feats through extroverted sensing. That being said, their feats of heroism and things like that. That being said, the intelligence, all the intelligence of discerning meaning from intuition, or all the intelligence of the dexterity or the strength of sensing, basically, even though that is a form of intelligence, it's looking at the world, and I call it the dumb world in the sense that you can look at nature and see a moose standing there in its stupidity with an air of authority and stupidity, as the writer Dennis Johnson writes in his great short story Emergency. But basically, there's this idea of nature kind of having this authority and stupidity and just being like dumb, mute, dumb in the sense of like mute also, like deaf and dumb, and kind of just doesn't really, it's not articulate, it can't explain. I mean, the whole world of sensing and intuition both, which is to say the whole world of perceiving, is the irrational world, the world outside of language to some degree, although there's a linguistic component as well, particularly to extroverted intuition, which makes linguistic puns and connections between things on linguistic levels as well. So just to review, so in the first session we looked at, you have perception and judgment, then you split perceiving into sensing and intuition. Then you split judging into thinking and feeling. And today we're going to be looking at thinking and feeling. I just want to make sure that we're all up to speed and kind of on the same page from what we've looked at so far. So the two forms of judging are thinking and feeling. They then both have more to do with people and the world of people, the world of communication, particularly this final division now we add is extroverted versus introverted. So we'll see that there's certain distinctions, introverted feeling versus extroverted feeling, and so on. Today we'll be looking at introverted feeling. And in the next session we'll look at extroverted feeling. So we're gonna split them up because they're just so different. And as I was saying before, in some sense, the biggest difference is between the same function in its introverted, extroverted attitude. In some sense. In other ways, there's differences. Obviously, the polarities are pretty different from each other. But really, just looking at so from the start, we kind of have these three fundamental divisions: perception and judgment. Each of those splits, and then introverted and extroverted attitudes. Okay, in the second session, we looked at introverted sensing and extroverted intuition. And so that was beginning to look at what is it if you're an irrational type, if your dominant function is irrational, and then what if it's introverted sensing or extroverted intuition? Well, if it's introverted sensing, that is a function that is basically internalizing everything and internalizing sense perceptions and keeping a sort of living journal of those sense perceptions inside that it can refer back to. And it's all of these fragmentary sort of kind of extracted or abstracted essences of various experiences. Something introverted sensing has in common with introverted intuition is that it can be kind of spiritual, as I was pointing out, like the spirituality of just washing dishes or sewing or washing clothes and hanging them to dry, and all of these, or gardening, or all of these kind of fundamental mundane things. But basically we saw introverted sensing very mundane, very connected to the irrational, unspeaking, although I guess it maybe is in some ways a little more verbally connected than the extroverted sensing, but basically connected just to the pure irrationality of the world. And the reason I say it might be a little more verbal is because its polarity is extroverted intuition, which is known for verbal fluidity and wit. And so then we saw, when you're looking at a type, that type, the inferior function is going to really pose a problem. Introverted sensing types are going to have a problem with extroverted intuition, sometimes like dark fantasies of all the things that could go wrong and bad things that could happen. Okay, then we switched over to the extroverted intuitive, and that's also irrational, also looking at the blind madness of the world, the irrationality of it all, also having primarily thing problems rather than people problems, right? Like as I was saying, like these irrationals are more in the world, just more comfortable in the world of things, more comfortable. But see this big difference where the introverted sense type is so comfortable with their controlled, rigid, organized, habitual. Basically, the extroverted intuitive would really feel trapped there. I was saying if you know Enneagram, that the introverted sensing type, the Enneagram archetype is kind of the 6, the loyalist. The extroverted intuitive archetype is more of the 7, who really wants, who has an appetite for a lot of adventure and wine, women, and song, and all of those things that extroverted intuitives are excited about. The adventures of life. So typically, of course, you find variety. Then in the last session, we kind of compared that to the introverted intuitive and the extroverted sensing type. And I guess these archetypes, so far the introverted sensing archetype is sort of the loyal, hardworking, blue-collar, sort of, I mean, of course, there's many varieties of introverted sensing types. It could also be the dexterous acrobat or the gymnast or any of these things. There's so many ways they can be. But just a sort of general archetype of introverted sensing is sort of, they're part of Kiersey's guardian temperament. They're protecting the values of the past, preserving the past, protecting heritage, protecting tradition, seeing the world through ancient eyes. Then you have the extroverted intuitive, who is getting rid of tradition, who doesn't want to be trapped, who doesn't want to be pinned down, who wants to be able to kind of adventure and experience and be in that chaos. Well, then we see with introverted intuition and extroverted sensing parallels there. The introverted intuitive is also a control freak like the introverted sensing type. The extroverted sensing type also wants that chaos and freedom like the extroverted intuitive. So we see a polarity, but there's a big difference here. And what I was saying is, it's the introverted intuitive is sort of the one who, instead of just preserving tradition or taking in the facts and looking at what happened before and expecting it to continue that way, right? The introverted intuitive is much more comfortable improvising, and they're much more comfortable basically having to be more directed or having to be self-directed or say what direction things should go, draw their own conclusions, coming up with their own conclusions. How do they do this? Well, the introverted intuitive, unlike the introverted sense type, is not taking in the sensory data strongly. The introverted intuitive is dimming, they're kind of like dimming the lights, they're squinting their eyes a little bit. They're trying to see the forest, not the trees. They're trying to see the big picture. They're trying to see the pattern or the trend emerge. They're trying to see what all these different things have in common with each other and what is that commonality, which would be the conclusion. And they're willing to really stake their reputation on that conclusion, on being right about that conclusion. The introverted sensing type isn't going to be so presumptive as to assume by filling in missing information, filling in the blanks, that they know the answer to something. But the introverted intuitive is going to look, 1, 2, 3, fill in the blanks, 4. The introverted intuitive will very confidently say, this is what fills in that blank. And that's why they typically score very high on IQ tests. Although, funny enough, it's the extroverted sense types that typically are actually among the highest testers in IQ. But this whole axis of introverted intuition to extroverted sensing is an interesting axis because it's a little bit adversarial to the more common. There's a lot more introverted sensing types out there than introverted intuitives, for instance, or extroverted sensing for that matter. Extroverted sensing is more rare than introverted sensing. So there's something where the introverted sensing is sort of creating this stabilizing force of history, maintaining and preserving the past. Extroverted intuition is looking for connections and sort of interplay with that. Then you have this whole other axis, the introverted intuitive to the extroverted sensing type, that are sort of adversarial to that entire status quo. And you have the extroverted sensing types who are really antithetical to the introverted sensing types, sort of the jocks versus the geeks, or something like that. Not always, because believe me, introverted sensing types can be very cool. And I think if we're going to look at what makes somebody appear cool or popular, we actually have to look to the feeling function, not to the sensing function. But sensing can be very cool in that both introverted and extroverted sensing types can be so physically oriented that they really like nice cars and they really like nice things and stuff like that. Now, of course, the same can be true for the intuitive. So we really can't make any predictions about a person's type based on what kind of car they drive or something like that. It's just as likely for an intuitive to totally ignore and foreclose on the sense dimension as it is for them to become kind of obsessed with it and then try to prove how sensory they are. So you can kind of end up in some very interesting configurations. Okay, well, that's all just to get us up to speed to where we are now, which is to say everyone we've looked at so far has been irrational. If you're one of the types we've already looked at, you're fundamentally irrational. I am. There's nothing bad about being irrational. Irrational is like saying, irrational is actually factual. It's saying the facts are more important than what you think they should be. The facts are more important than your imagination of what makes sense, right? So the irrationality is actually not a bad thing. Yeah, and here are our full 4 polarities. So as mentioned, we've already looked at 2 of those polarities. We've already looked at introverted intuition and extroverted sensing. And before that, we looked at introverted sensing and extroverted intuition. So everything we've looked at has been irrational, and this is now going to be our first look at a rational polarity. The polarity of extroverted thinking to introverted feeling. So what does it mean to be part of a rational polarity, to be a thinking or a feeling type? Well, first of all, it means that you're fundamentally oriented towards people in a way that the irrational types aren't. The perceiving types are more concerned with pure perception. They're less concerned with the... So it's almost... they're a little more fatalistic. The perceiving types are a little more like, this is the way life is. Now, there are nuances to that. And in advanced Jungian typology, like you find in the objective personality system, they have something they call the sexuals, which is the sexual modalities. And the sexual modalities, you'd actually find that people that have what's called feminine sexual modality of sensing are a little more wishy-washy about sensing, or I guess just, I shouldn't say wishy-washy, that's kind of maybe a bad way to put it, believe that the sensory world is constructed socially in some significant way such that there is no real factual truth in the way that the so-called masculine sensing will find. Now, this is all very advanced Jungian typology, and since we're in an introduction to Jungian typology, I will save that for the advanced class, which, if this is an interesting topic to you, and I hope it is, then I hope you will join and explore further and deeper, because it is a very, very deep, very nuanced area of study. But I will just say, regardless of the sexuals, because that's a more advanced and actually a very controversial topic, that the sensory function, that both sensing and intuiting types, regardless of whether they are sense dominant or intuitive dominant, are just more oriented towards the facts and the irrationality of the facts. And the sensing types may seem to be more just the facts, whereas the intuitives are going to take those facts and then make a bunch of assumptions from them. So the extroverted intuitives are going to kind of multi-contextually like shift context or try playing out those facts in different contexts and try to imagine, what if we changed business models with taking the same facts, the same fundamental pieces, could we use them in a different way? That's what the extroverted intuitive is going to do. And then the introverted intuitive is going to maybe try to make some assumptions from that. Well, what can we assume from these facts? We can draw this conclusion. And a sensing type might say, how can you draw that conclusion? That's not a safe conclusion to draw. I get into this actually as an introverted intuitive myself with computer programming. I actually have worked a lot with an extroverted sensing type who, it's so interesting seeing our dynamic where I make all these conclusions and assumptions, and he says, you don't know that, you have to prove that, you can't just draw that conclusion or assume it. And so I see him as laboriously going over all of these things that I've already assumed are true, although sometimes my assumptions are wrong. So he has a good point there, right? It's rare for an intuitive to assume wrongly, but they do. That's kind of like the cost of doing business as an intuitive. Okay, so what does it really now mean to be a judging type, to move on to this totally different way of being, this thinking and feeling? Well, we see that there are ways still of investing in other and self. So that's what that libido graphic is showing, is that the extroverted thinking is going to really, the extroverted thinking type is going to invest in others through their extroverted thinking, and they're going to pull that feeling in from others, or they're going to feel the others basically. I guess this is a good question. It's a little bit more obvious when we're looking at the perceiving functions how the flow of libido works. An introverted sensing type feels the flood of sensory impressions come into them. The smells, the taste, everything. They're like a finely tuned photographic plate. This is how Emma Jung described it, and this is the term that von Franz uses in her lectures on Jung's typology on the inferior function when she really talks about the introverted sensing type, these finely tuned photographic plates that take in sensory information. So that's kind of obvious, right? And an introverted intuitive also taking in impressionistic intuitions and drawing conclusions through this sort of flow of libido towards the self. Then the extroverted also makes sense. The extroverted intuitive chasing the outer world because they're seeing some connection there and they don't want it to get away, and they're investing heavily in the other. The introverted is investing heavily in themselves. We can see with even the extroverted sense type, it's kind of an obvious example, this flow of their libido into the other. They're almost merging with the other. They invest so much in their car, for instance, and they kind of merge with the car through their extroverted sensing. And so they're always waxing the car and washing the car and filling up the gas and kind of feeling like that they themselves are the car and that their thirst is being sated by the, filling up the gas tank. These kinds of things, how extroverted sensing can merge with its environment. It's kind of obvious, but then when we look at the same graphic, how does it work in this case with the extroverted thinking flowing one way and the introverted feeling for the introverted feeling dominant flowing the other way? How does that work? Well, I think the key here is we have to really go a little bit even beyond. First of all, we have to talk about what are thinking and what is feeling, thinking and feeling, and then we have to go beyond the basic understanding to put it in context, that they're still investing in other and self. And other can be a person or it can be an object, right? My example with extroverted sensing was like a car that they're invested in, but they can also be really invested in a relationship. They can be invested in an activity that they're a part of. They can be invested in a team that they're a part of. Or even in an outcome, in some external outcome in the world, like invested in completing a project or winning or who knows what, right? There's different things they can be invested in. Being in a band and going on tour with the band and all this stuff. So it can be people, it can be things, it can be anything really. So now that but we got to look at, so what are feeling and thinking? These are two ways of passing judgments. And feeling and thinking as ways of passing judgments, it can be hard to think of how does that have to do with the flow of libido, right? This is showing the flow of libido. And as we saw in the first session, libido is a concept that Jung does not use just to mean sexual interest in a kind of Freudian way, although I don't think Freud uses it that way either. But for Jung, it's a generalized term generalized to all psychic energy. all energy to invest attention in something, to learn a new language. You need to have libido, and you need to be able to invest in that. To be in a new relationship, to be present with someone, to go to lunch with someone and have a conversation with them, you have to invest some libido. You have to have some energy to be able to pay attention to them, and so on. So the flow of libido and how it relates to thinking and feeling is really, we have to really look at judging as importance, saying what's important. That's not important, this is important. It's measurement, it's comparison. And so you're always comparing to something. Like, to say this is good, you have to say something else is bad. This is preferred, that's dispreferred. We're going this way, we're not going that way. We're ordering this, we're not ordering that. I'm eating this food, I'm not eating that food. Like, you always have to replace it with something. You can't just be like, I'm not eating food, I'm not going anyway, right? So judging always has to determine, and thinking and feeling are two different ways of determining a selection process. And the way that this works with libido is, if say you're an extroverted thinking type, your libido is basically investing very, very heavily in other people and other things that you are, let's see, how can I describe this? Extroverted thinking is really good at interfacing. It's good at communicating, and it's good at interfacing with systems as well. So it can communicate with people, but it can also communicate with bureaucracies, with corporations. It can, I have extroverted thinking as a secondary, as my auxiliary function, so I'm very good at like going through paperwork and forms and reading documentation and kind of interfacing with systems, but also people, but people in a systematic way, people who are also interfacing with the system, so we can kind of work together with that system. So if I were an extroverted thinking dominant, see, for me, it's my auxiliary function, so it's a tool. It's like a hammer that I pick up. It's something I do. It's something that I just can employ and can use when my intuition isn't working fully, or my intuition can't figure it out. So my thinking says, let's talk through this, let's work it through, and let's try to come to a conclusion here using thinking rather than intuition, which is usually how I draw conclusions. Just intuitive knowing, but I can't really show my work. Thinking is then being able to like elaborate it and kind of talk it out and talk about different options. And it's a selection option. Should we do it here? Should we do it there? What if we started at this time? No, what if we start later? So basically, if I were an extroverted thinking dominant person, then my primary libidinal flow in life would be into the things and the people and the systems and all of those things that I've put my thinking into and that I've connected into. And so I would be investing very heavily in basically the outer world, and I wouldn't really be investing in myself and my own values as much. I would be investing more in what I consider worthy causes. So take an extroverted thinking type, what they consider a worthy cause, what they're willing to invest in, well, they're not really conscious of that, because unconsciously, see that introverted feeling, unconsciously, their introverted feeling is pulling in all this libido and pulling in all this attention and gathering all this information and so on, and it's actually going to pass judgments on its own kind of autonomously without their extroverted thinking really being aware of it. So they're consciously so invested in something. Extroverted thinking types can be very invested in the outer world of status and symbols. So John Beebe loves to use the Wizard of Oz as the sort of, there's like one of each of the types there. Like you can see Dorothy as a feeling type and so on. The wizard is the extroverted thinking type. And as the extroverted thinking type, he has the power of symbols, and he knows how to work within the symbolic reality of the world. It's like the lawyers of the world, the lawyers and the business people, and these people who are very involved in the outer world, but they know how the outer world works. They know how to use the outer world and take action in a way, but not like the extroverted sensing type takes action, or the extroverted intuitive. Those are very action-oriented, and they will take some direct action to make their impact in the world. Extroverted thinking will somehow work with the system and will basically interface with others and invest heavily in the social frameworks. These can be great salespeople and great at investing in other people. So it's funny because it's like extroverted thinking, you might think, well, are they invested in doing math? Like, are they invested in like sitting on a rock and thinking all day? No, that would be introverted thinking types, because the introvert, all the libido is flowing towards them, so they're investing heavily in themselves. Now, an extroverted thinking type will still invest in themselves. All extroverts do. They do it unconsciously, autonomously, not really aware of it, and they might not invest enough in themselves. They might prefer investing in others, more comfortable for them, because their whole idea is the power in numbers. If I invest in this company, if I invest in these people, if I invest in this source of revenue externally to me, this thing that's bigger than me, these activities that I'm a part of, then I will be supported. Whereas if I only invest in myself, well, first of all, how narcissistic, right? I think a lot of extroverts might confuse introversion with narcissism, because introverts can be so self-absorbed and self-invested. But it doesn't mean they're narcissistic, right? Narcissism is its own thing. So, okay. So then we look at that same thing, the introverted feeling type. They're consciously aware of all of that energy flowing towards them, and they're unconsciously aware of their investment in others. They're unconsciously aware of what their extroverted thinking is doing, how their extroverted thinking is really plugging in and connecting to other people's thought processes and how other people think and what other people think, and they're not even aware of that. So I think here's something to kind of realize. When we looked at the extroverted thinking type, they're really good at connecting to how others think, just like an extroverted feeler is really good at connecting to how others feel. So the extroverted thinker can really rapidly join a company and kind of see what standards people use at the company and what people think and what people basically is like and dislike, or prefer and disprefer, but in terms of the system and how the system works. And in order to get the orders ready, you have to put them all on one page, but if you want to split them up to send them there, you got to put them on multiple pages. It's like all of the bureaucratic details. Like if you want to file this form, you do it this way. If you want to file that, you do it that way. If you find a lot of thinkers, both introverted and extroverted, as computer programmers, because there's so many little rules and little nuances there. And so an extroverted thinking dominant type is going to really rapidly be able to connect to how other people think and kind of use an X-ray vision into what others are expecting and what they prefer and disprefer when it comes to certain thinking things, as opposed to feeling things, which are more value judgments, right? Thinking things are more practicalities and technicalities and like logistics and details. So the extroverted thinking type is going to be very comfortable and understand how others would, think, but what they might not be aware of is their own introverted feeling, which is how they themselves feel about it. They might not know how they feel about something. In fact, they might be very uncomfortable asking themselves how they feel about something, even asking if they have the right to feel a certain way about something, which, of course, everyone has the right to feel the way they feel. Introverted feeling types know this. The introverted feeling type naturally feels empowered to feel the way they feel, and they feel the authenticity and the veracity of their introverted feeling function telling them this is true and this is false and this is real and this is fake and this is authentic and that's inauthentic. And so basically it gives them a validation that empowers them to pass a judgment. That person is racist. That person is sexist. That person is selfish. That person's a criminal. That person's a this. That person's a that. They're empowered to pass that judgment as a feeling judgment, even as simple as I don't like them. Whereas an extroverted thinking type might hold themselves to the impossible ideal of trying to like everyone, not letting themselves dislike someone, not letting themselves think that a homeless person is smelly and disgusting and gross, because what kind of horrible person would look down on someone so unfortunate, right? Or something like that. Whereas an introverted feeling type might see them and see them as smelly and disgusting and so on, but then also beyond that have this deep empathy and this merciful, loving feeling underneath all of the disgust, where they allow themselves to experience the complexity of the feeling, that they're simultaneously totally grossed out by that person, but they also have a lot of empathy and care, but they maybe also have some fear and apprehension. But then you find somebody who's an extroverted thinking dominant type who's not in touch with their feeling, and they're not going to let themselves think that, so they're going to pretend they're not disgusted by that person. They're going to pretend they're not, and they're going to be and they're not going to allow themselves to feel that, so they won't even feel the true mercy or the true love or the true care or concern beneath that, because they won't let themselves go into the feeling at all. The feeling is kind of held at bay, and instead they're really just going through life in this external world of connecting through others, camaraderie with others, not really asking themselves deep down what they feel, because there's this sort of assumption that their feeling doesn't matter. Okay, so let's just look a little more at the extroverted thinking type. So if you're an extroverted thinking type, then you're very comfortable basically when you are able to clarify things. Extroverted thinking is very clarifying. You're very comfortable when you have clear division of labor. You're very comfortable when you can interface with others and interact with them in a way that you can kind of confirm and check and kind of work together. It's not really that you're even gathering information. You're more just looking for them to confirm the information you have. It's really coordinating with others. Extroverted thinking types are very logistical and very good at coordination, very good at scheduling, very good at interacting, interfacing. Their inferior feeling can get really poisoned. And what I mean by poisoned is that anything unconscious, we're not really aware of what's happening there. And so things can happen without us realizing. So the extroverted thinking type can be going along and going along and going along, and then the other person can do something that reminds them of someone who hurt them, and that unconscious reminder will trigger the unprocessed feeling that they never resolved previously, and that can then be applied to the new person. And they can have this huge dislike of this person because that person reminds them of someone who betrayed them 20 years ago. And so the extroverted thinking type can be really unconscious of their allegiances. They can be like the most patriotic, perfect person in terms of their, like growing up completely with super strong allegiances, and then one day can turn on a dime and just say, wow, I can't believe the atrocities my country has committed, and I'm now going to be an anti-war protester and all this, and they can have just as strong conviction in that department. So the inferior introverted feeling can be this really invisible, really strong conviction, but it can also get poisoned. It can get corrupted. Introverted feeling dominant types are constantly checking if something aligns with their values. So they're constantly in touch with things, basically not allowing themselves to be corrupted. If they're given trust and responsibility and someone tries to bribe them, the introverted feeling type would have such a strong conscience and guilt around it, they would likely turn down the bribe. Although they can be corrupted through their thinking, and they might be talked into it by saying, look, it's for the greater good, because it's going to, they're given a whole lot of reasons and thinking reasons, and then they can be tricked into it. But the introverted feeling type can be kind of gullible and tricked because their thinking isn't really thinking things through. But the extroverted thinking type can be really unethical while still taking a moral high ground and feeling morally superior, because they're not really examining and asking themselves if that matches their authentic values or not. They're not asking themselves, is this authentic or not? Is this real or fake? Is this genuine? They're not in touch with that. And then it erupts and kind of kicks them out of commission and knocks them over. And that's when that inferior introverted feeling just overwhelms them, and they just feel it all rush to them and rushes at them all at once, all of their regrets and all of their questions and all of their remorses and all of their darkness and their macabre inner sort of sentiments, and it turns out they actually have a whole lot of really negative feelings that they've suppressed. See, people hear extroverted thinking type and they think some kind of brainiac. Extroverted thinking types are affable, warm, funny people. They're very similar to extroverted feeling types. I would say the most similar, here's a pretty heretical, maybe bombastic statement. The most similar functions, let me show the graphic here. The most similar functions here, okay, the most similar, if you were to pair into 4 pairs, what are the most similar? Extroverted thinking and extroverted feeling. Introverted thinking and introverted feeling. Introverted intuition, introverted sensing. Extroverted intuition, extroverted sensing. So even though they're very different, and I've described how differently, like an introverted intuitive can be like really confident, and an introverted sensing type can be really humble. Introverted intuitive can be making a lot of assumptions, and the introverted sensing type is afraid to make assumptions. Obviously there's big differences, but they're still the most similar. It's like the introverted perceiving, the extroverted perceiving, the introverted judging, the extroverted judging. Those are the fundamental categories. Now, if you're going to look at the most extremely different ways of doing things, it's going to be introverted feeling and extroverted feeling, introverted thinking and extroverted thinking, introverted intuition, extroverted intuition, introverted sensing, extroverted sensing. Those polarities are going to be the most... So, and then these are the polarities that we actually find with people, right? This is the actual polarity that you have, which is kind of a mixture of the two. So it's kind of funny. It's like, yeah, it's like a mishmash. But basically that's just to say, if you're going to look at extroverted thinking types and really want to understand the extroverted thinking type, you have to see them as very similar to the extroverted feeling type, which we will look at next week. So both extroverted thinking and extroverted feeling types are very invested in other people, very invested in what other people think of them. They care very much what other people think, and they're going to try to convince you they don't care. So one of the ways you can tell extroverted thinking, extroverted feeling types is they're going to put on an air of indifference, but it's going to be kind of a pose because it's going to look good. They don't want you to see them as the kind of person who cares what they think. They want you to see them as someone who's very, of what you think rather, as someone who's very thick-skinned. So they're going to put on this air of being very thick-skinned. And that's kind of their push, right? The introverted feeling might put on an air of being very thin-skinned and pretend to be a little more thin-skinned than they actually are, pretend to be more sensitive than they actually are. There's a great quote from Marie-Louise von Franz, herself a thinking type. She said, these feeling types, they're so tyrannical, they tyrannize under the guise of taking offense. So they pretend they're so sensitive, but their sensitivity is a guise for tyranny. So they're just, she saw the feeling type as a way of getting their way and kind of getting preferential treatment by pretending to be hurt and offended and sensitive and thin-skinned and so on. Anyway, kind of an interesting view from the thinking type. She was an introverted thinking type. So the extroverted thinking type, like the extroverted feeling type, very invested in the outer world, conquering the outer world by merging with it, connecting, getting comfortable with those things, living in it. It's like being a part of the outer world. The outer world is really the thing for them. So if they do something, they're really invested in the activity that they're doing actually being, having a nice experience there and putting money into it and putting time into it and making it worthwhile. And the people who do like the party planning committees and stuff. I'm an introverted intuitive. I do parties, but I just plan them internally. I don't have a party planning committee, right? Because I just internally model and mentally visualize what I want it to be, and then I kind of use my extroverted thinking to logistically make it happen. Sometimes we have a meeting or a committee, and that's my extroverted thinking connecting to others. Well, an extroverted thinking dominant person, like an extroverted feeling dominant person, is going to start with the party planning committee or start with the meeting. And I guess the big difference is that the extroverted feeling type, they're going to be more connected with what everybody wants. So they're going to go in the meeting and go, what do all the stakeholders want, right? What do people like? What do you dislike? The extroverted thinking type isn't going to really care about what people like or dislike. They're just going to assume we're all doing this because we all like to do this. That's just an assumption. That's just a given. How do we make it work? So their extroverted thinking is going to look at the logistics. What's the best day for it? Is there a reason to do this day over that day? Is there a reason to do it earlier than later? Is there a reason to end early this time? Should we change it in some way? Should we keep it the same? Is there a reason to change it? Is there a reason to keep it the same? So they're not really looking at likes and dislikes. They're looking at reasons. And I guess that would be a really fundamental heuristic or rule of thumb you could use for thinking and feeling types. Thinking types are going to assume that they like it, assume that other people like it, assume that people are good, assume that they are good, right? Just make a bunch of assumptions that everything's hunky-dory in that regard. They're not going to test or check if people are authentic. They're going to assume that they're authentic. They're going to assume that their desires are real and not fake, and there's not some deeper desire beneath it. They're going to kind of take things at face value, right? And that is making a whole bunch of assumptions about likes and dislikes. They're not going to assume when it comes to reasons. They're not going to assume there's a good reason for things. They're going to say, maybe there's no good reason for this. Let's remove it. Should we get rid of this? Should we get rid of that? It's like, say you're hired to do a sequel to a big blockbuster movie, and you come in as an extroverted thinking type, you're going to immediately look at what do we need to change? What do we need to do with this and that? You're not going to look at what people like and dislike. If you're an introverted feeling type, you're going to really ask, what do people, or even, not even what do people like? You're going to ask, what do I like? So an example would be Lord of the Rings. Those are made by an introverted feeling dominant person, Peter Jackson. Well, what does he like? very big images of people's faces. Like he does these big close-ups, like 2/3 of the screen is their face, and very emotional and very heartfelt and very authentic. He didn't want to make it fake. Those movies have a strong sense of authenticity, of real emotion, real caring, real tears, real heartbreak, real hope, real pain, real suffering. I mean, it's like all of it has to be real. And so as an introverted feeling type, he's constantly asking himself, is it real? Does it feel right to me? Does it feel wrong to me? Does this feel good? Is it aesthetically pleasing? Is it ethically pleasing? Does this connect to me? Does this plug into my feeling? Not do I plug into their feeling, right? But does this plug into my feeling? Does this make me feel something? Do I feel righteous indignation when that happens? Do I feel really angry when that good person is wronged by a bad person? That's what's important. Like, but not in a minute, but also introverted feeling doesn't want to manipulate. It's not going to manipulate. It's going to allow the other just to feel the way they feel, right? It's like free to feel the way you feel. I'm free to feel the way I feel. It's very open in that way. So Peter Jackson making Lord of the Rings, very different approach than an extroverted thinking type. An extroverted thinking type, and I don't have a good example off the top of my head, but maybe like Michael Bay or something, although he could be extroverted sensing, I don't really know. But an extroverted thinking type is just going to assume everybody likes what they're doing, and they're going to instead look to technique and formula and like logistics and things like that. They're not really plugging into what people like, because that would be extroverted feeling, nor are they plugging into what they like, because that would be introverted feeling. So they're not really just connected to the world of likes and dislikes. They're kind of alien to that world. And they just assume, oh, we're making a movie, people are going to like this movie, and we're doing it. We are authentic people, it's going to be authentic. Like they assume everything is going to be authentic. Introverted feeling is checking, is this authentic, is this fake? Oh, that's fake, throw it out. Extroverted thinking isn't going to catch it, so they're going to put some really phony, fake, hammy, basically shtick of feeling in there. So this is the other point. Sophisticated feeling is not what you might imagine. So let's just finish up here on the extroverted thinking type, and then I'll look at the introverted feeler. So the extroverted thinking type, yeah, they're going to be really out of touch with their feelings, and then periodically overwhelmed by their feelings. So there can be a real grip of that inferior function of feeling, and not just overwhelmed by their feelings, but overwhelmed by all sorts of negative feeling judgments about self and others, and all sorts of things they couldn't allow themselves to let out because a good person doesn't express that. And the same is true for extroverted feeling types. Extroverted feeling type won't let out a lot of their really negative thoughts. They might just think really negative things about people, but they won't let it out. The extroverted thinking type might have really strongly negative feeling judgments. That person's a charlatan, that person's a fake, that person should quit, whatever, but they try to suppress it, or they try to keep it to themselves, or but then every now and then it comes out, and you start to really see, wow, this person actually is not just endlessly positive, I would even say that the extroverted thinking type is not as endlessly positive as the extroverted feeling type, because they're trying to be more realistic than positive, but the extroverted thinking type is still invested in this sense of, if we don't question the value of it, but we only try to get it done, then we can just, then that's like the good way to do it. So it's like you're all working on something, and the extroverted thinking type is like, the work will set you free. Like, just focus on the work. Don't question if the work is good. Don't question if it's bad. Just assume you're doing good work. Assume that it's for the best. Assume the film will be good. Keep working on it. Turns out they're making Transformers 19 or, whatever, and it's a total junk movie. And people that have a strong sense of authenticity, the introverted feeling types, are going to ask themselves, do I feel authentic doing this? No, I quit. But the extroverted thinking types are just going to assume. So I think the advice for extroverted thinking types would be to spend one day a week where you really go into your introverted feeling, and you just only do what you like, and you ask yourself if you like or dislike it, no matter how dumb it is, no matter how much others would reject it or make fun of you for it. It could be cats singing songs. It could be, it could be like whatever. It could be the most tacky thing in the world. It could be the dumbest thing in the world. It could be the dumbest reality show. It could be The Bachelor. It could be like whatever. You like something that you like. Let yourself have your guilty pleasure shamelessly, And then also through that, start to develop the feelings you have about it, and start to develop, even if your feeling function likes things that are distasteful to others, what does it find tasteful about them? What does it like in them? And you can start to kind of figure out a little bit and to develop some of that complexity of feeling. Because as I was saying, the extrovert thinking type, their typical problem is that they're not in touch with the complexity of feeling. So they don't allow themselves to feel the negative things, but they can't really get to the deeper positive feelings either. They end up having a highly successful life that's really boring and nothing ever happens, and they end up feeling hollow and empty and always kind of wondering and so on, because something inside themselves hasn't been paid attention to, hasn't been given that time and attention. So it's not like they can just be in that feeling function all the time. I'm not saying extroverted thinking types are just going to be creative all the time, but creativity is a great way to use introverted feeling, because you're asking yourself, do I like this? Well, if I like it, that's all that matters. Do I like this picture I made? Do I like this painting? Do I like this song? Do I like this melody? You're kind of using your introverted feeling, and I think that's a really powerful outlet for extroverted thinking types. So when we look at the introverted feelers, they're not going to have problems with staying true to themselves and with authenticity. They're not going to have problems getting in with the wrong crowd. Something I didn't mention is that extroverted thinking types can just assume people are good, so they can befriend people that they're not really checking if those people's values match with their own. They don't even necessarily know what those people's values are. So someone could be racist or sexist or prejudiced in all sorts of ways, or phobic in all sorts of ways, and that extroverted thinking type might not ask themselves, might not even notice. Or later they do, and then they feel terrible and have all this shame and embarrassment. How could I support that person for so long? How could I be friends with that person for so long? How could I be involved with that for so long? You see them turn on a dime a lot. Like extroverted thinking types can be so invested, so loyal, turn on a dime. Well, the introverted feeling type, they're going to have very different problems. Their problems are not problems of, am I in touch with myself and my values, and am I being authentic? Their problems are going to be problems of logistical things, taking care of things in the outer world problems, interfacing problems, systems problems, not being able to work with bureaucracy. Kafka is thought to be an introverted feeling type who wrote about the horrors of bureaucracy. That's how introverted feeling types experience bureaucracy. Extroverted thinking types get to experience this beautifully functioning machine where every piece is working with every other piece and they're all interfacing perfectly together. Well, the introverted feeling type experiences the horror, like in the beginning of the movie Brazil, where a literal bug flies onto it and then it gets smashed, and because it gets smashed, the text can't be read, and so the person vanishes in the system, and the rest of the movie is like the horror of a bureaucratic nightmare. So for the introverted feeling types, they have this real fear of bureaucracy and of it's like this simultaneous, like the thing we always have to keep in mind of the inferior function is that it's imbued with like holiness, like the numinous beauty of God and religion and spirit is all mixed up in there. And so that introverted feeling type can also see the beauty of the logos, of logic, of the intellectual mind, of the Word of God, even the beauty of law. I think one of the greatest horrors for the introverted feeling type is that they can't trust the law. Because basically we want to be able to trust our inferior function, but we can't. So it horrifies us, it terrifies us. Like the extroverted thinking type wants to be able to trust that people are naturally good, and they don't need to worry about if it's real or fake, or if they're being tricked or not, or anything like that. If they're being deceived, they don't want to have to check for that. They want to just trust and just move on with life, trusting in the goodness of things. But they can't. Not always, and that's what's going to really get the extroverted thinking type. Well, the introverted feeling type also wants to be able to trust. They want to be able to trust that the law is upheld, that people hold their word, that the contractual binding power of thinking is valid. Basically, that thinking is their God. You can kind of say that the inferior function is the personification of the God for that person. So for the thinking type, their God is a God of love and a God of feeling, the God of agape, the God of crying and tears and beauty and aesthetics and all of these things. Well, for the introverted feeling type, their God is logic. Their God is the word. Their God is the bond. Their God is the contract and the promise and the agreement. I mean, I would even say promises and contracts and all of that are the realm of extroverted thinking, that the realm of the symbolic, that I do this for you, you do that for me. This is our agreement. We've come to an agreement in the symbolic order, and as long as we uphold the law and there's a punishment and repercussion for breaking the law, then the symbolic order is sound. And I think that introverted feeling types can be really horrified. Minor spoiler for the TV show Game of Thrones. In the first season, there's a point where a person is made king, and he actually has the contract written by the previous king, expressing the previous king's wishes before the king died, the previous king. Well, this new king has this paper proving he's the king, and it gets torn up right in front of him. In this horrifying moment, that show, by the way, Game of Thrones, is written by an introverted feeling type. And I think that George R.R. Martin, the introverted feeling type, that it's his own horror with how the world can disregard contract and law and thinking and so on. Like the fact that thinking isn't actually trustworthy. You can't actually trust it. You couldn't actually trust God to protect you there. You can't actually trust this big other to make sure that all contracts are honored, and that if they're not honored, that they are punished. Actually, good people do get punished and bad people do go free. And this is the greatest horror of all for the introverted feeling type. I really see the introverted feeling type as in some ways the most ethical, naturally, because it's their job to develop ethics, which doesn't mean adopting somebody else's ethics or somebody else's morals. It's so funny because you find Kant, we started this whole thing looking at the Kantian distinction of perception and judgment. With Kant, he's a thinking type. And as a thinking type, he's trying to foreclose on feeling, trying to find a way out from having to do the work of feeling, because the feeling function is hard work. These are all labors. Each one of these cognitive functions is labor. Like the feeling function is not just I have a feeling. It's, at least the introverted feeling function, I have a feeling and let me elaborate, and how do I judge that feeling, and how do I develop that feeling, how do I understand that feeling, are there other feelings connected? And then extroverted feeling doing the same thing with somebody else. You have a feeling. Let's see what your feeling is. How do I know what your feeling is? Let me look at your facial expressions and try to suss out what your feeling is. You'll notice extroverted feeling types are often scrutinizing the other person's face, trying to kind of see how they feel. So basically where we're at now is we have this, as our first foray into the judging functions. These are now people who are much more comfortable in the human realm where things are rational and they're supposed to make sense. It's not like the irrationals, the perceiving types, the sensing and intuitives, who are really comfortable in a world of chaos and control where you're fighting between the order and the chaos, and you're basically on the side of order as an introvert or on the side of chaos as an extrovert, and you're kind of taking sides in the world of things. Now we're in the world of people. And so in the world of people, the extroverted thinking types are very invested in other people and in working together logistically to create bureaucracies and to create structures that allow people to work together. Like, let's all come together to do this event, or let's put this on, or let's put that on, or let's do something. Let's build something together. Let's make something together. Extroverted thinking is very logistical and very oriented towards the other. Introverted feeling, it's so much oriented towards themselves, and it's their own values, their own likes and dislikes. They can be tricked by being given really terrible reasons for things and just not checking if it's a good reason or not, right? Extroverted thinking is going to be checking. Why is this here? Should we get rid of this? Do we need this? We haven't used this for a year. Let's take it to the thrift store. Introverted feeling isn't really thinking through the reasons. They're preoccupied with their own process of making sure that they're authentic, making sure that they're remaining centered in who they truly are, and kind of making sure that any rough edges are smoothed out. So they have feelings, but they have to keep experiencing those feelings until they smooth out the rough edges. As we'll see next week when we look at introverted thinking types, that the introverted thinking type does the same thing, but with thoughts. They have to keep mulling things over, thinking things over, and processing them and digesting them. So that's something I just want to convey here, that each of these functions is some sort of labor. There's labor involved. There's either emotional labor, or there's intellectual labor, or physical labor, or some other kind of intuitive labor even. I guess you could call it imaginative labor. But either way, there's energy being invested, there are calories being burned, there's work being done. All of us have feelings, all of us have thoughts, all of us have hunches and intuitions. All of us have sensory input coming in, tastes and sights and smells and memories and so on of what those are. We all have those things. What it is to have that function is to actually do something with that prima materia. So everyone thinks, but a feeling type might not continue thinking. They might just set something somewhere not thinking about what's going to happen when someone else comes in and knocks it over. Simple example. A thinking type, they're going to have feelings and they're going to be, but their feelings, they might not have a strong vocabulary. They might just say, I'm sad or I'm angry. They might not be able to untangle those feelings. They might be able to say, I'm mad as hell, but not realize that part of them is also disappointed and part of them is also hopeful. And they might not be able to feel the disappointment and the hope mixed in with the anger because they're glomming it all together, you know? So it's kind of, it's realizing that, and they might not know what they like or dislike. So it's kind of, it's realizing that everyone's going to have feelings, everyone's going to have thoughts, but that being able to develop a feeling and understand that that's something that you actually like, that's different. You might have a feeling and not recognize it's something you actually like. You might think it's something you dislike and it's truly something you like. This is what happens. I mean, extroverted thinking types can get really mixed up where they're totally in love with somebody, crazy about them in a relationship, but they hate them and they're criticizing them all the time. I remember I knew a couple, it was extroverted thinking type with an introverted intuitive who was more on the feeling side. And so you have this introverted intuitive and this extroverted thinking type, and it's like the extroverted thinking type really likes this person, but then is complaining about them all the time because they don't know that they like them. And they don't know that they actually like all these qualities. Like this person smokes cigarettes, and they're like, you need to quit smoking. Well, sorry, you're attracted to someone who smokes cigarettes. Part of you is attracted to cigarette smoking. That's part of what the feeling function is there to do, to tell you that you're, it's like people who have same-sex, desire and don't realize it. Not even necessarily that they're gay or bisexual, maybe they are, but they have some desire and they don't know it, because their feeling won't let them. They're out of touch with their introverted feeling, and there can be many reasons for that, but they're kind of obliviously going along, and other people notice it. And they're like, hey, I think you're really attracted to that person. They're like, no, I'm not. And then that can even come out in homophobia and like gay bashing and stuff like that, just as an extreme example of how the extreme repressed desire can come out in weird ways. But really, the feeling function is there to tell you what you like and dislike, or what other people like and dislike. And it does more than that too. I mean, it's here to the introverted feeling function to basically ensure that you remain authentic and true to yourself, and it's kind of there to be a conscience, there to make you feel guilty if you do something that betrays yourself. It's kind of ironic that Louis C.K. got canceled for sexual misconduct because he had previously, himself an introverted feeling type, had said that he always asks himself when he's about to do something that might be unethical, would I want my daughters to know about this? And if the answer is no, then he doesn't do it. And that's an introverted feeling type. Now, it's ironic, of course, because he did do something that I'm sure he wouldn't want his daughters to know about, and I'm sure he regrets greatly, because as an introverted feeling type, he's probably full of regret, unlike extroverted thinking types who they might have some regret that might overwhelm them and knock them out of commission. The rest of the time, they might be kind of out of touch with that. But regardless of conjecture on who is or isn't regretful or remorseful of past mistakes, it's the introverted feeling function that is there to apply the emotional labor of processing and digesting the feelings and elaborating them. How do you feel about those feelings? Do you like this? Do you dislike this? And going deeper into that. So we all have all of these things. It's really just the dominant function is going to be a function that you can employ pretty much in every situation in life, and that you've kind of put everything through its filter. And then the inferior function is going to be something that's mostly neglected and avoided until later, out of necessity, we kind of have to engage with it. And then we actually find, even though we've been afraid of it, and even though it might have been the source of a lot of our anxieties and worries, there's actually a lot of value there, and we get a lot out of it. So later in life, those introverted feeling types find a tremendous value of developing intellectual systems. Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, is thought to be an introverted feeling type. Jung also typed Freud as an introverted feeling type, although I put him as an introverted thinker, but there's some debate there. But basically, the introverted feeling types later in life in particular can really elaborate quite an extroverted thinking system. And in fact, that's what von Franz accused Freud of doing, how Freud had a very rudimentary basic system, but it was profound to him, so he would kind of put everything through this system, and then he would end up interpreting every dream the same way, always about sex, and it was kind of very basic and base and not really very profound at all, but it was profound to him. I would say that it was because of his inferior feeling, actually, and his dominant introverted thinking, but that's my own interpretation. Then as far as Jacques Lacan, I do see him as an introverted feeling type, and I think it's the same thing where as he developed his thinking systems, he basically went more and more into his thinking later in life, and it became something very profound for him that was not necessarily intelligible to others. Like, he thought it was much more intelligible than it actually was, because he wasn't actually checking to see if it made sense to others or if the reasons he gave were reasons that were convincing to other people or not. He was kind of just, it was like this bizarro extroverted thinking that he was developing. But you do see that later in life, the inferior function brings a lot of gifts and brings a lot of development to the person. And so, yeah, if you're a thinking type, later in life, you're going to be more and more comfortable, if you're an extroverted thinker, more and more comfortable with your own feelings and with just allowing yourself to say, I don't like that person and I don't even know why. I don't need to give you a reason why. Basically, there's a feeling earlier in life that everything has to have a reason, that thinking oriented. Introverted feeling types are going to be much more comfortable not having reasons for things. That's their inferior function. So they're going to say, I don't like it. They're going to maybe give you a reason they haven't really thought through. Like, the reason they give you is not going to be a very good reason. Really what it comes down to is just the own self-validating sense that they dislike something. They shouldn't even have to give you a reason. It should be enough that they don't like it for them. But then later in life, they begin to actually look for reasons and look at what reasons other people give for things and kind of be more open to the external world. All right, well, next session we will be looking at the introverted thinking and extroverted feeling types. I know that this has been a lot of function soup as we've jumped around through these cognitive functions, and this is kind of the most chaotic time, and then after this we will be kind of simplifying a bit, I hope. So after we've looked at the four polarities, we'll start looking at how Jungian typology relates to Myers-Briggs, the auxiliary and the tertiary function, and we'll look a little more at the inferior function through a few different lenses as well. So really excited to be doing this class. Thank you for joining me in this series, and I hope you've been enjoying this. Next session, we will be looking at introverted thinking and extroverted feeling. Thanks so much.